On Friday, the 21st of August, 2020, 58-year-old Ray Denz Polino was driving back to his home in Miami, Florida, in his police SUV after completing a midnight shift. Ray Denz was a 25-year veteran of the Miami police force, and over the last 2+ decades, he had routinely done midnight shifts. So, this was nothing new. When he got to his house, he parked his SUV in the driveway, and like always, he went right into his house. He didn't talk to his wife, Clara, or his son. He just went straight up to his bedroom and immediately fell asleep. About 4 hours later, at 5 p.m., Ray Denz woke up and he expected to hear his wife's voice somewhere in the house. So when he didn't, and the house was just totally silent, something told him that something was off. So he climbed out of bed, he put on his clothes, and he went downstairs to look for his wife. When he got down to the living room, he saw his son sitting on the couch, but he didn't see his wife. And so he asked his son, "Hey, have you seen your mom?" And he would say, "No, I haven't seen her." But sensing on his dad's face that something was wrong, he said, "Hey, I'll help you look for Mom." And so the two men began searching the house, yelling out for Clara. And Ray Denz began calling his wife, but she wasn't picking up. And after several minutes, the two men reconvened in the living room, and they started going over whether or not she had told them about some appointment that day, and that would explain why she wasn't in the house. But after talking about it, they decided that she didn't have any appointments, and she should be home right now. And so the men decided, maybe she went outside and she's talking to a neighbor, or, she went for a walk and she's talking to somebody on the road. And so they decided they would go outside and search the outside of the property. When they got outside, Ray Denz went towards the back of the property, and his son went towards the front, down towards the driveway. And so, as Ray Denz is making his way around the back of the property, he hears his son scream out for help. Ray Denz comes running back around the property, and he sees his son standing in the driveway, with the door of his police SUV wide open. 4 hours earlier, after Ray Denz came home, he parked his police SUV right in the driveway, like he always did. And for some reason, he left the car unlocked. And so he goes in the house, and he falls asleep. And while he was sleeping, Clara, who was home, she exited the house and walked down the driveway to his SUV. She opened up the door and went inside. It's believed she was looking for something, although we don't know what she was looking for. And while she was in the back of his car, fishing around for whatever it was she was looking for, the door she had entered the vehicle and shut behind her. And because this is a police SUV, the back seat was designated for suspects. And so the back two doors did not open from the inside, and there was a very thick partition separating the back seat from the front seat. So Clara could not just reach over the seats and honk the horn to get someone's attention. And Clara did not have her cell phone, so she couldn't call anyone for help. And when she screamed out for help to somebody out on the road to help her, her screams were severely muffled. And the back windows of this police car were heavily tinted, making it extremely difficult to see that there was a person in the back seat of this car. So for 4 hours, Clara desperately screamed and kicked and punched and did everything she could to try to free herself from the situation she was in. All the while, the temperature inside the car continued to go up. The SUV was parked in full sunlight, no shade whatsoever, and the temperatures that day were over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And so, by the time Clara was ultimately discovered, the inside of that SUV had effectively become an oven. Ray Denz ran over to his vehicle, and he pulled his wife out, and he started doing CPR on her. But it was too late. She had died of heat stroke. Her death was ultimately ruled an accident. On May 22nd, 2021, a father and his young son were out for a walk in their small suburban town, just outside of Barcelona, Spain. When they reached their downtown, they were going to turn around and walk back home. But the boy pleaded with his father to make a quick stop at the old theater. The reason the boy and many other kids in the town loved going to this old theater was because out front of it was this huge papier-mâché statue of a dinosaur, a stegosaurus to be exact. And so, after a little bit of convincing, the father finally agreed, and they started heading in that direction. After they turned the corner and could actually see the dinosaur statue, the boy took off running, while the father stayed back and walked leisurely, watching his son the whole time. And as he's watching his son, he can see he gets right up to the statue, kind of suddenly stops and stares at something on the bottom of the statue. And so the father notices his son has seen something peculiar enough to make him stop and stare. And so he yells to his son, "Hey, what do you see?" And the son just points at the back right leg of the statue. And so the father thinks this is really weird. So he jogs up to his son, and he crouches down right next to him and looks in the direction his son is pointing. And at first, the father believes all his son is pointing at is this fairly obvious crack on the outside of the statue, on the back right leg. And he's thinking his son has just noticed that the statue is kind of falling apart. But as he's looking at this crack that his son is pointing at, he realized his son was not pointing at the crack. He was pointing at what was behind the crack, what was inside the dinosaur statue. And when the father realized what he was looking at, he grabbed his son, stood up, and ran in the other direction and called emergency services. A few minutes later, the police and fire department show up in front of this old theater. They get out, and they go up to the statue, and they confirm what's inside this back right leg. Afterwards, they go to their trucks and they get out chainsaws. Eventually, they were able to carve a big enough square on this back right leg that they were able to remove the thing that the father and the son had seen originally, and that was a dead man's body. Not much is known about this dead man, except that he was a 39-year-old man who his family had reported missing a couple of days before he was actually found. While we don't know this for sure, it's believed he decided to crawl inside the statue when he realized the belly of the dinosaur was movable. Now, it's not entirely clear how he figured that out. Either the belly was already moved, and he saw the opening and so saw the opportunity to crawl inside for some reason, or he was poking and prodding at the statue and discovered the belly was movable, moved it aside, and then again seized the opportunity and crawled inside. But either way, the man crawled inside the statue, and then, once he was in the dinosaur, his phone slipped out of his hand or slipped out of his pocket. And then, instead of falling out of the dinosaur onto the ground, it fell inside the dinosaur and slid down the inside of the statue until it fell into the bottom of the bottom right-hand leg. And so, the man decides to go after his phone. And so, on his belly, he slides over to the back right leg. And then, he begins lowering himself head first into the leg, reaching for his phone. And so, as he's kind of slowly lowering himself down, using his legs to pin himself inside the statue, he gets closer and closer, and he's almost about to grab his phone when his feet lose their grip, and he slips and falls head first all the way to the bottom of this back right leg. The space he was in was so tight, he was not able to turn himself around and climb up and out again. In fact, it was so tight, he could barely move. His arms were pinned by his side, and so he couldn't use them to even push himself back up and out. And because he could not bend his legs, he could not use his legs to pull himself back out again either. And so this man most likely began screaming for help, but for whatever reason, nobody heard him. And so, after what must have been several agonizing days, the man finally just died. His autopsy has not been made public, so we don't know for sure what actually killed him. Although one could speculate he died of either dehydration or perhaps asphyxia from being trapped in this really tight space, where his chest may not have been able to expand all the way, and so he would have eventually suffocated. Following the gruesome discovery, the dinosaur statue was removed from the front of the old theater. In the early 1980s, John Harder was the classic athletic, popular kid at his high school in Delaware, Ohio, which is a relatively small town just outside of the state's capital. But unlike most stereotypes that paint high school jocks as being these total jerks that bully people, and they're kind of stupid, John was none of those things. He was incredibly friendly and very warm-hearted, and seemed to get along with everyone. John also was known for having a great sense of humor. In particular, he liked to play these kind of harmless pranks that would make people smile. Like the time he very enthusiastically joined the cheerleaders during a high school pep rally, despite not actually being a cheerleader himself. John was set to graduate from high school on the 5th of June, 1983, and his plan was to study accounting at Kent State University the following year. A few weeks before his graduation, John's high school began selling these tickets to a grad night at a huge amusement park called Kings Island. Kings Island was located about 2 hours west of John's high school, and it was home to dozens of roller coasters, water slides, and many other attractions. During their so-called grad nights, this amusement park would shut down their public operations and not let anybody into the park that did not have these special student tickets that they gave to local area high schools. John, who was 17 years old at the time, was very excited at the idea of going to this grad night, and so he went and purchased tickets along with about 20 other students from his high school. At about 3:30 p.m. on Friday, May 13th, John and the other students who had bought grad night tickets met up outside of their high school. While this was a school-sponsored trip, these students were responsible for driving themselves to the park. And so, after all the students were accounted for, they all piled into a couple of their cars and they began their journey to the park. After a few stops along the way to get food and go to the bathroom, these students finally arrived at the park at about 7 p.m. And on the drive, John, who had been a passenger, had drank half a bottle of rum and about 3 to 6 beers. And so, when he got out, he could barely stand. He was so drunk. And so, the students made their way over to the front gate. They showed the attendant their grad night ticket, and they were allowed inside. And surprisingly, despite it being this special night where only people with these tickets were allowed in, it was still pretty crowded. There were lots of students that apparently wanted to come to this event. Once John and the rest of the students from the Delaware High School had come inside the park, there was no rule that they had to stick together for the duration of their time there. And so, they all kind of broke into their separate groups and went their separate ways. In John's particular group was his girlfriend Pam, and for the first hour they were in the park together, all they did was bicker and fight. Onlookers would say John looked visibly upset and very emotional and very drunk. By 8:30 p.m., when John's group had gotten in line for this roller coaster, John was now openly saying, "I don't want to be here anymore. I just want to go home." It was pretty obvious he was still just mad at Pam, and that's why he was saying all this, just trying to make Pam feel bad. And so, some of the group members told John just, "Hey man, calm down. You're overreacting. Just try to enjoy this ride, and then afterwards we'll get some food. It'll be fine." But it was pretty clear that John was really worked up and seemed incapable of having a good time at this point. But regardless, John and the rest of the group, they got on this ride at about 9 p.m. And then, after the ride was over, they disembarked and they walked away from the ride to regroup and figure out what was next. And they're looking around, and John is nowhere to be found. And so, after waiting for a few minutes and actually walking around looking for him, they decided that, you know what, he was really upset before he got on this ride. He probably just wanted to walk away and be by himself for a bit. I'm sure we'll see him later in the night. So, John's group without John just continued going around the park, going on different rides. And for the next few hours, they kind of forgot about John. It wasn't until the end of the night, when over the loudspeaker the park official said, "Okay, we're closing the park now," that they started walking out and wondering where John was. And they were convinced, you know what, I'm sure he's back at the cars. He's probably waiting for us because he just wants to go home. So, they leave the park. They get out to their cars in the lot, and John's not there. And so, at this point, the group's starting to get a little bit concerned because no one knows where he is. They're meeting up with the other groups from their high school. No one's seen John, and so they're all just kind of staring at the front gate, waiting for John to come out, but he doesn't. And then, eventually, the lights in the park start shutting down, and the security guard comes out front and locks the front gate, and that's when the group knew they had a problem. After an extensive investigation by police, this is their best guess as to what happened to John. After John and his small group rode that roller coaster around 9 p.m., John very quickly disembarked the ride before anybody else in his group could see him, and then John stumbled his way towards the replica Eiffel Tower that this park was famous for. This tower stood at about 300 feet tall and was built to be an exact replica of the Eiffel Tower in Paris, France. But this one at Kings Island was only a third the size. It had 3 elevators that went up the center of the structure, and the elevators would stop at a 55 platform and a 275 feet platform where guests could look out and have a great view of the park. While today the only way to access these 2 viewing platforms is through these elevators, at the time John was at the park in 1983, the park actually had a flight of stairs that went from the ground all the way to the very top of the tower that went right up the middle of the structure. And the public was allowed to take these stairs all the way up to the first platform, that 50-foot platform. And while the stairs did actually continue beyond that, up to the 275-foot platform, the public was not allowed to go any higher on the stairs than that first platform. And so, if you took these stairs, once you got to the 50th platform, there would be a big fence right on the stairwell, preventing you from going any farther. And it says, authorized personnel only. Don't go any farther. And so, the only people that would walk up those additional flights of stairs were staff that had a special key. When John stumbled his way over to the base of this replica tower, he did not get on an elevator. Instead, he took the stairs. So, he made his way up to the 55th platform. And then, when he got to this 6F tall gate, preventing him from going any farther, he just climbed up and over it and continued walking up the stairs, and nobody stopped him. He finally came to a stop just below the 275 feet mark. And so, he's on the stairwell, and at this point, he turns and faces the inside of the tower. It's all these metal beams all over the place, and he climbs over the railing of the stairs he's on, and he climbs onto this narrow beam that's actually a part of the support structure of this tower. And he grabs onto the beam above him, and just begins walking along this beam towards the center of the tower, where the 3 elevator shafts are. Now, there's no safety net on either side of John. So, if he slips and falls, he's falling hundreds of feet to the ground. And if he keeps walking and actually gets into the elevator shaft, there's nothing protecting him from being struck by one of the elevators, because the people who built this tower were not thinking about people walking on these exposed beams hundreds of feet up into the air. This is a totally dangerous and unauthorized area. But John just continues shimmying across this beam until he does get to the middle of the tower. And now he's literally standing, looking down into the elevator shafts. And as he's most likely looking around, admiring where he was, one of the elevator cars below him began to start moving. To understand what happens next, you need to have a rudimentary understanding of how this elevator worked. A large metal rope was attached to the top of the elevator car, and from there, it was thread up the elevator shaft all the way to the top, where it was fed through a pulley that was anchored to the ceiling. And then, that rope was fed right back down the shaft to the bottom, where it was attached to a counterweight. A counterweight is just a large, heavy weight that's designed to balance this elevator car on this pulley system. Without the weight, the elevator car would just slip off of that pulley. And so, anytime the elevator car moved up, the counterweight would move down, and vice versa, making sure that car was always balanced. And so, John is standing right on the edge of this elevator shaft, presumably just kind of looking around, admiring where he was, when down below him, that elevator car starts to move. And it starts to actually descend away from John. And so, the car itself is not necessarily a threat to John. However, its counterweight is, because if the car is going down, its counterweight is going up, and it's right in the path of John. And so, as John is leaning out over the shaft, looking around, this counterweight comes screaming up and picks him off of the beam he's on and carries him up into the shaft. The impact on John was so strong that it's believed he was actually impaled on some of the exposed metal wiring on top of this counterweight, and he got totally tangled up in all of the cables on top of there. And so, as John is desperately trying to free himself, the elevator operator there was always a staff member inside of these elevator car she actually noticed when John got stuck on the counterweight. But of course, this worker would have no idea that's what it was. They would later recall it just felt like the car suddenly jumped. And so, this worker, fearing that something had gone wrong with the elevator car itself, he decided he would ride it all the way to the bottom, let everybody get out, and then ride back up to the top totally empty to make sure that the car actually worked before allowing people back on. And so, the worker went to the ground. Everybody got out. He closed the doors. He began his ascent. He got to that first platform at 55 no issues. He got about 10 feet above that first platform, so at about 60 feet, when all of the sudden, he hears an unbelievably loud thud on the roof of his elevator car, causing his car to immediately come to a stop. And then, blood began pouring over the sides of the car, over the windows. After getting stuck on the counterweight, John probably did everything he could to try to free himself, but he just couldn't do it. However, when that elevator worker decided to go back up again to test the capacity of the elevator car, it reversed the direction of the counterweight that John was stuck on. And so, as that car was going up, John began going down. And it was on this descent that parts of John's body must have been dangling off of this counterweight, and they must have struck one of the beams as he was going down. And that beam effectively pried him off of whatever he was stuck on and threw him over the edge into the center of the shaft. And so, John would fall 200 feet, and he would land on top of that elevator car, dying instantly. The park was very quick to block off the ride and the whole scene, and got police involved very quickly. So, only a very small number of guests and employees were aware an accident had even happened. And very few of them were aware that it had been a fatal accident. As for the police, they knew they had a dead body, but they had no way to identify the body. There was no ID cards on John, and so they had no way to let his friends know that were in the park, or to tell his family. And so, it wasn't until that night, when John's friends are out in the parking lot waiting for John to come out again, that they got really worried, and they went up and spoke to a security guard at the front of the park. And that security guard, after hearing their story, would tell them that actually there had been an accident in the park and there was a body, and the police are still trying to identify this body. And so maybe you guys want to go over to the hospital and see if it's your friend. So sure enough, the friends went to the hospital, and they would confirm that the body was John Harder. To this day, no one knows for sure why John did what he did. Some say he was just drunk, and it was a dumb decision that led to his death. Others say he was suicidal. But many of the people that were close to him say, no way, he was not suicidal. And other people say, you know, John, he loved the attention. And so perhaps this was a dangerous stunt gone too far. But regardless of his reasons, John had clearly intentionally entered an area that was off limits and got him killed. At 8:30 a.m. on Friday, the 18th of July, 2014, 41-year-old law school professor Dan Markle drove his two young sons to a preschool in an upscale neighborhood in Tallahassee, Florida. It was already a hot summer day, and it was only going to get hotter, with temperatures set to go over 90 degrees Fahrenheit by the afternoon. So Dan decided to let the boys in on a surprise he'd been planning. He glanced back at his sons, sitting in their car seats, and said when he picked them up after school, they could go right to the pool and spend the rest of the day swimming. The boys got so excited, it sounded like Dan had just told them they were going to Disney World. Dan laughed, and then drove a little further down the road, turned into the preschool parking lot, and parked his black Honda Accord. Then he stepped outside, helped his boys out of the car, and walked them both up to the door of the school, where one of their teachers was waiting. Dan crouched down, gave each of the boys a hug, and told them he loved them and to have a great day. Once the boys were inside, Dan turned around and headed back to the parking lot and got into his car. Dan was average height with short brown hair and a beard, and he wore glasses. And today, he was dressed for the gym in a red t-shirt and black shorts. But before he went for his workout that morning, he knew there was a phone call he needed to make. So he grabbed his cell phone from the pocket of his shorts, pulled up his contact list on the screen, and stared at the name Wendy. Dan let out a long sigh, and his mind started to wander. Wendy Add was Dan's ex-wife. They had been divorced for a year and had been separated for almost 2 years. But there were still days when Dan couldn't believe the two of them were not together anymore. Dan and Wendy had met on a dating website 10 years earlier. At the time, Dan had been a law school professor at a university in Washington, D.C., and Wendy was a law student at the University of Miami in South Florida. And soon after they'd exchanged a few messages on the dating site, Wendy had decided she wanted to meet Dan face to face. So she hopped on a plane and flew to D.C., and the two of them hit it off in person just as much as they had online. Wendy was totally taken by Dan's incredible intelligence, and she could tell he was driven and that he had a bright career ahead of him. And right after Dan had met Wendy, he told a friend he felt like he'd won the lottery. Wendy was about 7 years younger than Dan, and she was beautiful, with long curly brown hair and blue eyes. She had grown up wealthy, but never really talked about money. Instead, she just talked about how important her parents and her older brother Charlie were to her. And Dan loved that because he thought family was the only thing more important than work or money. And Dan also loved that even though Wendy was studying to become a lawyer, just like he was, she was a lot more fun and more of a free spirit than most of his colleagues in the legal profession were. Wendy had dreams of writing a novel. She had been a contestant on the television game show The Weakest Link, and she'd even considered joining the circus at one point. And Dan felt like Wendy was a breath of fresh air in his relatively routine life. And by the time Wendy had flown back home to Florida a few days later, both of them were already convinced they wanted to spend the rest of their lives together. And so, not long after that first meeting, Dan took a teaching position at Florida State University in Tallahassee, and Wendy joined him there when she finished law school. And then, just 8 months after they had first met, Dan and Wendy were engaged. Even now, sitting in his car in the preschool parking lot and staring at Wendy's name on his phone, Dan could still remember how stunning she had looked when she walked down the aisle in her white dress at their wedding, almost like she was glowing. And for a time back then, Dan couldn't believe how lucky he was to have a wife like Wendy, and how great his life had turned out. And things had only gotten better when Wendy gave birth to their 2 sons, a little over a year apart. And at least for a while, Wendy had seemed really happy too. She'd gotten a teaching job at Florida State, and she, Dan, and their boys would often drive almost 7 hours south to spend time with Wendy's parents and her brother Charlie. So Wendy still felt connected to her own family. But back in the car, Dan felt like his and Wendy's wedding, their first meeting in D.C., and his relationship with Wendy's family were all now ancient history. He was never quite sure why their marriage had actually fallen apart, but he was working hard now not to dwell on the past and to try to be happy in the present. Dan took a deep breath and finally called Wendy. He got her voicemail, so he left her a message reminding her he was leaving town soon for an academic conference, so they would need to work out their custody schedule with their boys. Dan and Wendy had joint custody of their kids, but they made accommodations for each other when one of them had to travel for work. Dan hung up and tossed his phone onto the passenger seat. Then he pulled his car out of the parking lot and drove off towards the gym, which was only a few minutes away. And as he looked out his windshield at the trees outside and the sun shining, he reminded himself that he had a fun day planned for him and his sons, and that even if his life was not perfect anymore, it was still pretty great. Dan worked out at the gym for over an hour that morning, and then he walked outside at about 10:45 a.m. He got into his car and drove off. And a few minutes later, he arrived in his neighborhood that was lined with large 2-story homes, with well-manicured lawns out front. Then, just before Dan pulled onto his street, he remembered he had to make another phone call. His oldest son was about to start taking piano lessons, and Dan had told Wendy that he would set everything up. So he grabbed his phone and he called the piano teacher. And the two men were still talking when Dan actually pulled into his driveway. Dan reached up and pushed the garage door opener that was clipped to his sun visor, waited for the door to open, and then pulled his car into the garage. Dan left the car running and the garage door open, while he sat in his car and kept talking to the piano teacher. But then, suddenly, Dan saw something move in his rearview mirror. He turned to look back and asked the piano teacher to hold on for a second. And then Dan saw someone walking towards his car. Dan turned and looked out the driver's side window to get a better look at this person. But before Dan could say anything, he heard a sound like a firecracker going off. Then Dan's ears started ringing. His vision blurred, and he fell forward against the steering wheel. At 10:50 a.m., about the time Dan had pulled his car into the garage, a married couple in their 70s were sitting on their living room couch in the house next door to Dan's. The couple had just gotten a new iPad, and they were spending a relaxing morning figuring out all of the features it had to offer. Then they heard the loud popping sound coming from the house next door. The man got off the couch and rushed over to the large bay window in the living room. He looked outside and saw a light-colored car peeling out of Dan's driveway. He looked at his wife, and he said he wanted to see what was going on, and that he was worried someone might have broken into Dan's house and just driven off. His wife told him to please be careful, and the man said he would be. And then he stepped outside. The sun was bright, and he shielded his eyes to block the glare as he walked across his lawn towards Dan's driveway. And as he got closer, he heard the sound of a car running. And then, when he looked into the garage, he saw Dan's black Honda Accord parked there. So this man figured he must have just misunderstood what had just happened. If Dan was parked in the garage, someone would not have been robbing his house, and the light-colored car might have just backfired and made the sound he had just heard. So the neighbor turned around, walked back to his house, and into his living room. But instead of rejoining his wife on the couch, he went back to the window and stared out at Dan's driveway. He just wanted to wait and see Dan pull out of the garage or close the garage door, and that way he would be sure everything really was okay. But after a few minutes, the garage door was still open, and Dan's car was still inside. The man leaned up against his window, squinted, and tried to see if there was any movement next door inside the house, but nothing was happening, and he started to get an uneasy feeling in his stomach. So he told his wife he was going to go back outside again to actually go check on Dan. This time, the neighbor moved quickly across his yard to Dan's driveway, and he could hear the car still running. He called out to Dan as he turned the corner, but nobody replied. Then he stepped into the garage, and immediately he stopped in his tracks. He felt broken glass crunch under his feet, and he knew something had to be wrong. The man rushed to Dan's driver's side window, and he gasped. Almost all of the glass in the window had shattered, and in the car, he saw Dan's body slumped over the wheel. The neighbor shouted Dan's name several times, but Dan didn't respond. So the man leaned in closer to the shattered window, and he saw blood in Dan's hair and on his face, but he could see that Dan was still breathing. So the man turned around and ran back to his house. As fast as he could, he threw the front door open, grabbed his phone in the living room, and he dialed 911-1. When the operator picked up, the man told him that they needed urgent help at the house next door. He said his neighbor was bleeding from his head, but he was still breathing. But for some reason, the operator asked the neighbor a bunch of questions about what specifically he had seen that had prompted him to call 911-1. The neighbor didn't understand what was happening. He just kept saying that his neighbor was slumped over in his car. There was blood in his hair and on his face, and they needed to help him right now. Finally, the operator said yes, they would send someone over. At that point, the neighbor hung up, ran back outside, and rushed over to Dan's garage again. He leaned into the shattered window and tried to talk to Dan. Dan didn't respond, but the neighbor could see Dan was still alive and breathing. The neighbor's hands were shaking, and he kept looking out at the street. He didn't understand why it was taking so long for an ambulance to arrive. Then finally, over 15 minutes after he'd called 911-1, the neighbor heard a siren approaching. But when he walked out of the garage and looked down the street, he saw a police car, not an ambulance. The police car parked in front of the house, and as soon as the officer stepped out, the neighbor ran towards him and waved him to come into the garage. And when the police officer saw Dan slumped over in the car, struggling to breathe, he didn't understand why he had been the one dispatched to the scene instead of an ambulance. So he called the station and said they needed an ambulance immediately. And then, after that, the officer reached into Dan's car and shut off the engine. Then finally, a few minutes later, an ambulance did arrive, and Dan was rushed off to the hospital. But as Dan's neighbor listened to the ambulance siren fade into the distance, he worried that the few minutes he'd waited before calling 911-1, and then all the confusion that had occurred with the emergency operator, had cost Dan so much time, and quite possibly his life. At around noon that day, Less than an hour after the ambulance arrived at Dan's house, Detective Craig Isom of the Tallahassee Police drove through a wealthy neighborhood, and he saw kids who were off from school for the summer laughing and playing in their front yards. But as Isom turned onto Dan Street, the flashing lights from squad cars and the yellow crime scene tape around Dan's house painted a very different picture. He parked his car in the line of cop cars on the street, looked out the window, and saw several officers moving in and out of Dan's open garage. Isom knew some people thought bad things never happened in upscale neighborhoods like this one, but he'd been a cop for 25 years, and so he knew bad things could happen anywhere. Isom stepped out of the car and walked up Dan's driveway. He was a stocky man with short-cropped gray hair, and today he wore a black golf shirt tucked into khaki pants. Detective Isom took off his sunglasses and stepped into the garage, where the first officers who'd arrived at the scene were looking at Dan's parked car. There was glass all over the ground, and Isom saw the driver's side window was almost completely shattered, and when he looked in the car, he saw a broken pair of eyeglasses on the floorboard. All Isom knew about the scene was that Dan Markle, a well-respected law school professor, had been found slumped over in his car with bullet wounds in his head, and that he had been taken to the hospital. Isom talked briefly with the other officers on the scene, and he learned that when they had checked the house, there were no signs of struggle or forced entry. He also learned that the next-door neighbor was the one who had found Dan and called 911-1. So, while the officers continued to photograph the scene inside of the garage and dust Dan's car for fingerprints, Isom walked next door and found Dan's neighbor still standing outside. Isom smiled and told the man he'd just like to ask him some questions, and the man said he wanted to help in any way he could. Then the man relayed his version of events from the time he'd heard the popping sound next door and gone to look out the window. And as Isom listened, one thing jumped out at him, the car the man had seen peeling out of the driveway. But this neighbor had not gotten the license plate number, and he could only say it looked like a pretty common car that was a light color. With that description, Isom knew finding the specific car might end up being impossible, but at least it was something to go on. Isom also learned from the neighbor that Dan had 2 young sons and an ex-wife named Wendy. Isom had no idea whether Wendy was connected to the car that had driven off from Dan's house, but in cases like this, the ex-spouse was almost always the first person to talk to. So Isom thanked the man for his help and then walked back to Dan's garage. By this point, police had gotten word from the hospital that Dan was not going to survive, and they would later learn that Dan had never regained consciousness at the hospital, and he had died at around 1 p.m. Isom also found out that, for some reason, the 911-1 operator had not made the call from Dan's neighbor a high-priority response. Isom didn't know if a faster emergency response would have saved Dan's life, but when he heard the news that Dan wasn't going to make it, his first thoughts were of Dan's sons. Dwelling on the 911-1 call wouldn't change the fact that 2 young boys would now have to grow up without their father, and that hit Isom very hard. And that news also made it very important for him to talk to Dan's ex-wife as soon as possible. Regardless of her potential involvement in what happened to Dan, she would still have to tell her sons that their father was now dead. So Isom walked back to his car, left the scene of the crime, and started looking for Wendy. At around 2:30 p.m., about 3.5 hours after the 911-1 call, Detective Isom pulled into the parking lot of a high-end shopping center. With the help of cell phone and GPS data, police had tracked Wendy down to a popular restaurant that was there. Isom got out of his car, walked into the restaurant, and scanned the tables. He spotted Wendy sitting with 2 other women. She was 35 years old, and she wore a dark blue t-shirt with a print on it and blue shorts, and she had her hair pulled up in a bun with her sunglasses perched on top. Isom stood there and watched Wendy for a few moments. She was talking with her friends and laughing, and so, on the surface, she did not appear to have any idea about what had just happened to her ex-husband. But Isom knew that didn't necessarily mean she was totally innocent. Some people were just really good at hiding things. So Isom made his way over to their table, and right away the 3 women stopped what they were doing and looked up at him. He smiled and said he was sorry to interrupt their lunch, but that he needed to speak to Wendy Ad. Wendy immediately put her hand up and had a very confused look on her face. Then Isam showed her his badge and told her he needed to talk to her at the station about an incident that had occurred that morning. And the look of confusion on Wendy's face turned to fear, and she wanted to know if her children were all right. Isam assured her children were fine, and then he asked her to come to the station. Again, Wendy looked at her friends nervously, and then she grabbed her purse and followed Detective Isam out of the restaurant. Once they were outside, Wendy climbed into Isam's car, and the two of them rode the 10 minutes to the police station in almost complete silence. When they arrived at the police station, another officer led Wendy into a small interrogation room where she took a seat at a wooden table. Even after being outside in the Florida sun, the light in the room seemed bright and glaring to Wendy. A few minutes later, Isam walked in carrying a small notebook and a pen. He closed the door behind him and took a seat across from Wendy at the table. Right away, Wendy wanted to know what was going on and why she'd been brought here. So Isam told her that earlier that morning, her ex-husband Dan had been shot and killed in his car while he was parked in the garage. Wendy immediately burst into tears and buried her face in her hands and kept saying, "Oh my God, oh my God." Then, at some point, Wendy looked up at Isam, and something in her eyes changed, like the lawyer in her had suddenly kicked in. She told the detective she understood why she was here. She was a suspect, but she said she had nothing to do with whatever happened to Dan. Isam told her he was just trying to get a better understanding of what might have happened, and Wendy nodded and then took a deep breath. Then Isam asked her where she had been that day before she went to the restaurant, where he'd found her with her friends. She said she'd been at home in the morning, had gone to the liquor store to buy a gift for a housewarming party, and then she went right to the restaurant. Isam scribbled notes in his notebook, looked up at Wendy again, and asked her if there was anyone she could think of who would have wanted to hurt Dan. But Wendy shook her head. She said Dan could be a tough professor and difficult to get along with at work because he was a perfectionist. But she couldn't imagine any of his students or colleagues doing something like this. So Isam asked Wendy about their divorce, and she told him it had gotten pretty ugly at first, and that Dan had not been the easiest person to be married to. But then she told him that she and Dan had been really working hard to get along better for the sake of their sons. Then suddenly, a look of panic came across Wendy's face. She remembered Dan was supposed to pick up the kids at school, and now they'd be left there alone. And when she mentioned her sons, she started crying again. Isam tried to comfort her and told her they would make sure the kids were okay. And he asked her if there were friends the police could call to make sure someone was at the school when the boys got out. Wendy took another deep breath, then grabbed her phone out of her pocket and scrolled through her contacts to get Isam a list of names and phone numbers. Isam said making sure the boys were taken care of was his top priority, so he got up from the table, crossed the room, and stepped out into the hall. And once he was out there, he asked an officer to call the list of Wendy's friends she had just given him to see if one of them could pick the boys up. And then Isam just waited and left Wendy alone in the interrogation room. During his time as a lead investigator, Isam had conducted his fair share of interrogations, and there were plenty of times he could pretty much immediately get a read on someone he was interrogating. Other times, though, people were just too hard to understand, and right now, he wasn't quite sure about Wendy. He believed she was grieving, and he believed her story about where she had been that morning, but he felt like she just wasn't telling him everything. He thought that could just be the lawyer in her, or maybe she was in shock, or maybe she really was hiding something. About 40 minutes went by, and Isam got word that officers had contacted one of Wendy's friends who said she'd picked the boys up at preschool. Isam thanked the officer, and then headed back into the interrogation room, determined to get as much information from Wendy as possible. So again, he took a seat across from Wendy, and then told her which friend was going to get the boys, at which point Wendy breathed a huge sigh of relief and thanked him. Then he looked her in the eye and asked her if there was someone in hers or Dan's life that maybe she hadn't thought about who could possibly want to harm Dan. At first, Wendy kind of laughed and joked that during the divorce, some of her family probably wanted to punch Dan on more than one occasion, but that was just because they loved her. But then Wendy stopped laughing, and she got a serious look on her face. She covered her mouth with her hand, and her eyes went wide. Then she looked across the table at Isam, lowered her hand, and said something had just hit her. There was somebody she hadn't thought about who hated Dan, her most recent ex-boyfriend, Jeff Lass. Isam wrote Jeff's name down in his notebook. Then he asked why Wendy thought Jeff might have a problem with Dan, and she said that she and Jeff had only been dating for a few months when Jeff started getting really jealous of any other man that she talked to. And she said Jeff couldn't stand Dan for that reason, and that Jeff had a bit of a temper. Then Isam asked what kind of car Jeff drove, and Wendy said a silver Nissan Sentra. Isam jotted that down in his notebook. A silver Nissan Sentra could fit the description of the car that Dan's neighbor had seen speeding away from the house. Isam thanked Wendy for all her help, and after 5 hours, her interview was finally over. Isam was a long way from ruling Wendy out as a suspect, but for right now, he really wanted to go talk to her ex-boyfriend, Jeff. After Detective Isam met with Wendy, police contacted her ex-boyfriend, Jeff, who was also a professor at Florida State. Jeff agreed to meet with police, and they arranged for him to come to the station on the afternoon of Monday, the 21st of July, which would be 3 days after Dan's murder. But on the morning of the 20th of July, so a day before Isam and his team would meet with Jeff, they walked into a local synagogue and stood at the back for Dan's memorial service. At the service, Isam was struck by the number of Dan's former students who spoke about how much Dan had helped them in school, and how his willingness to push them to always do better had helped them achieve more than they thought possible. But it was the end of the memorial service that would stick in Isam's mind for years to come. Dan's mom stood at the front of the synagogue and spoke about how much she loved her son, and how much he had meant to so many people, not only at Florida State, but to the Jewish community throughout Tallahassee. And then, through tears, she invited Wendy and the boys to come join her. Wendy, along with her boys, made her way to the front of the synagogue and listened to her former mother-in-law talk about how much Dan's children had meant to him. And while this happened, Detective Isam listened to people seated throughout the synagogue start to cry. Then he saw Wendy's mom stand up, cross in front of Wendy's dad and brother Charlie, and make her way to the very front as well. And there she promised Dan's mom, as one grandmother to another, that Dan's family would always have a place in Dan's sons' lives. Isam left the memorial service, and he was taken by how many people that single act of violence in Dan's garage had affected. And as he drove away, he was determined to find out who had pulled the trigger. And he hoped Wendy's ex-boyfriend would help him get closer to the truth. The next day, on the afternoon of the 21st of July, Jeff Lass sat behind a wooden table in an interrogation room just like the one Wendy had been in. Jeff was 42 years old, and he was thin, with brown hair and a beard. He wore a t-shirt and jeans, and he wore glasses. When Jeff had first arrived at the station, Detective Isam had been surprised by how much he looked just like Dan. Isam stayed outside of the room and watched on a camera feed as another investigator stepped into the interrogation room first and took a seat at the table across from Jeff. Even before the investigator started talking, Jeff started fidgeting in his chair and tapping his fingers on the table like he couldn't sit still. Then the investigator asked Jeff if there was anything he could tell them about Dan and Wendy. Jeff smiled and said he could tell them a lot. Looking at the screen, Isam got the sense that he wasn't really watching an interview. He was watching a guy get everything off his chest he'd ever wanted to say about his ex-girlfriend. Without prompting, Jeff gave a very long monologue about his and Wendy's relationship and how he still loved her, even though he knew she didn't love him. He barely stopped to take a breath, and he used his hands to accentuate certain points in the story. Jeff admitted that he did not like Dan because, as Wendy's ex-husband, Dan was always going to be in their lives. And he complained that at Florida State, Dan was one of those professors who thought he was smarter than everyone else, and that totally rubbed Jeff the wrong way. But despite all that, Jeff said he would never do anything to Dan. The idea of shooting someone was completely foreign to him, and he said he had been in Tennessee on the day of the murder, and he could give police the names of a bunch of people who would vouch for him. But even after Jeff had offered a potential alibi, he kept talking. And as Isam continued to watch from outside the room, he couldn't believe how much Jeff was willing to say without even being asked. and at times, Isom couldn't tell if he was watching a man put on an act, or if he was watching someone who just really had nothing to hide. But then, during a rant about how sometimes he felt like Wendy wasn't being completely honest with him, Jeff said something that stunned Isom and the investigator who was actually in the room. The investigator put up his hands and asked Jeff to stop talking for a second, and then asked Jeff to repeat what he had just said. Jeff laughed a little, caught his breath, and repeated himself. And when Isom heard what Jeff had to say again, he felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. And what Jeff had said would make Isom look at the case in a completely different way than he had in the first few days of the investigation. And Isom's new approach to the case would eventually help police find that mysterious car that had peeled out of Dan's driveway, and that would lead them to who had killed Dan. Some elements of Dan Markel's murder are still under investigation and pending trial. But based on interviews, evidence at the crime scene, and surveillance camera footage, this is a reconstruction of the police's leading theory about what happened to Dan on the 18th of July, 2014. A little before 8:30 a.m. on the 18th of July, the killer sat in a light green Toyota Prius vehicle on the street a few houses down from Dan's house. They were calm, and each one knew their role. The driver would make sure they never lost sight of Dan, and the shooter, who was sitting in the passenger seat with a Smith & Wesson revolver in their hand, would pull the trigger when the time came. Then the killers watched as Dan's garage door opened, and they watched him pull out onto the street with his two sons in the back seat of the car. The driver waited a few seconds and then followed Dan. The driver wound his way through the neighborhood, keeping Dan in their sights without getting too close to his car like a hunter stalking their prey. And when Dan pulled into a preschool parking lot, the driver found a spot on the street to park and wait. Finally, after Dan had walked the kids up to the school, gone back to his car, and made a phone call, the killers watched him drive back onto the road, and they followed him. They still didn't feel like they were in a hurry, and they never panicked. They knew what their goal was, and they would wait until the perfect moment arrived. So when Dan drove to the gym and went inside to work out, the driver just found a parking spot outside a few spaces away from Dan's car, and the killers waited again. While Dan was in the gym, the killers sitting in the car just talked and joked as if nothing out of the ordinary was happening. And then, after they'd been sitting there for over half an hour, the driver backed out of the parking spot, drove around the lot, and found a new spot. The driver didn't want anyone who had seen the car while walking into the gym to see the car still there when they walked out. Then, after over an hour had passed since Dan had gone into the gym, the driver spotted Dan again, walking out of the gym and back to his car. And at this point, the killers felt like they were getting close. Their sense of anticipation was starting to grow. The killers followed as Dan drove out of the gym parking lot and back into his neighborhood. And as they approached Dan's street, the killers saw Dan make another phone call. Then, at about 10:50 a.m., almost 2.5 hours after the killers had first started tailing him, Dan arrived home and pulled his car into the garage. At this point, the killers pulled into the driveway and parked the Prius. Then the shooter opened the passenger door, stepped outside, and crossed in front of the Prius. They saw Dan glancing back at them from his own car, so they rushed into the garage before Dan could have a chance to close the door. Then the shooter walked within 2 feet of the driver's side window and saw Dan turning towards them, still holding his phone. So the killer took a breath, raised the gun, and fired. Glass from the window shattered, and the killer threw their arm up to protect their face. The .38 caliber bullet had struck Dan in the cheek and lodged in his ear canal. Dan's ears were ringing, and blood ran down his face, but he could still move, so Dan raised his left arm in a desperate attempt to protect himself. But the shooter didn't waste any time. They fired again, and this time, the bullet broke Dan's glasses and lodged deep in his skull. At this point, Dan slumped forward. The shooter ran out of the garage, back to the Prius, threw the passenger door open, jumped into the car, and shouted for the driver to go, go, go. The driver gunned the engine, peeled out of the driveway, and sped off down the street. Minutes later, the killers drove out of the neighborhood and onto a highway heading south toward Miami. And when they were far enough from the crime scene, the driver made a phone call to a woman in South Florida and told her everything had gone according to plan. And then that woman hung up her phone and told her boyfriend Charlie that the job was done. It would take Detective Insomnia, the Tallahassee police, and members of the Federal Bureau of Investigation years to put all the puzzle pieces together. But they would come to believe that Wendy Add's brother, Charlie, had paid two hitmen roughly $100,000 to murder his sister's ex-husband. It would turn out that Wendy had no desire to share custody of the boys with Dan, and that she had even filed a motion with the court that would allow her to move with the boys 7 hours away to South Florida so she could be closer to her own family. But Dan had fought the motion, and the judge had ruled in his favor, and so Wendy was stuck in Tallahassee. As of now, police have never officially tied Wendy to Dan's murder. But her ex-boyfriend Jeff was key in turning their suspicions toward Wendy's brother, Charlie. During his long-winded speech in the interrogation room, Jeff had said he didn't think Wendy would kill Dan, but he was almost sure Charlie would be up for it. That was what had stunned both the investigator in the room with Jeff and Detective Isom, who was watching the interrogation from the camera outside. It would turn out that when Jeff had gone to South Florida on a trip with Wendy to meet her family, Charlie had spent most of the time talking about how much he hated Dan to the point that Jeff thought it was obsessive and strange. Charlie also believed Wendy should be allowed to live wherever she wanted with her sons. And what seemed even more bizarre was that Charlie had once made a joke to Wendy that he could just hire a hitman to kill Dan if he wanted to. Charlie implied that he had enough money to do anything and get away with it. So Detective Isom began to seriously consider the idea that Dan's death may have been a murder for hire, possibly arranged by Charlie from South Florida. With help from state law enforcement agencies, Isom expanded the police search of surveillance footage to include cars driven from South Florida to Tallahassee on the day of the murder, ones that matched the description Dan's neighbor had given. Surveillance footage from bus cameras, toll roads, and businesses led police to a light green Prius, which they were able to track from Miami all the way to the parking lot of Dan's gym. After following Dan home, the Prius was later identified as a rental car, and police traced it back to two men in Miami, both with criminal records. One of those men would eventually confess to the murder, revealing that he and his partner had been connected to a woman who was dating Wendy's brother, Charlie. The driver of the Prius was sentenced to 12.5 years in prison. The shooter, who pulled the trigger and killed Dan, was sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years. The woman who recruited the killers and who was dating Charlie was also sentenced to life in prison. And again, Wendy has never been officially linked to the murder of her ex-husband. Despite the touching promises made at Dan's memorial service, Wendy and her family kept Dan's parents from seeing their grandchildren for years. But Dan's parents fought in court just like they believed their son would have. And in June of 2022, the Markell Act was signed into law. It now protects grandparents and grandchildren from being kept apart when certain tragic events take place. Altogether, in 1887, 35-year-old Robert Luer was a very talented detective, working in Paris, France. He was so talented that, periodically, he would get called upon by other police departments around the country to help them solve their most difficult cases. And so, that year, there was this coastal town in northern France that had this string of sailors that went missing, and nobody had the slightest idea what had happened to them. And so, naturally, Robert was called in to investigate. The night Robert arrived in this town, it was very late, and Robert was tired. So he went straight to his hotel, and he went to bed. The following morning, he got up, and he went straight to the local police department to meet the local officers that he would be working with on this investigation. But when he got there, he was told that the missing sailors case had been lowered in priority because during the night, a murder had been committed down on their beach. And so that was now their main focus. And so they apologized to Robert and said, "You know, I'm sorry you came all this way for nothing, but since you're here, do you want to help us in this beach murder investigation?" And Robert said, "Sure." The victim was a middle-aged man named André Monet, who owned a dress shop in Paris, France. He had recently moved to this coastal town to enjoy the beautiful scenery. When his body was discovered early that morning, it was quickly determined he had been killed by a single gunshot wound to the chest, where the bullet actually went clear through him, out the other side. But they hadn't found the bullet. There were no suspects, there were no leads, there was no clear motive. However, they were able to rule out robbery because there was still money in Andre's pockets. And so, Robert and the other local officers left the police station and made their way down to the beach, where they began examining the area where Andre had been found. The local officers focused on looking for the bullet, while Robert decided to walk a little ways down the beach to see if there was any evidence that had been overlooked in the initial search. And after only walking a very short distance, Robert noticed some barely visible footprints that appeared to pass right by where Andre's body had been found. And these footprints, they continued past that area and then up a flight of stairs up onto the road, where they disappeared. Robert called over the other officers and told them to make plaster casts of these footprints so he could analyze them. What that meant is the officers would literally just pour liquid plaster inside of these prints, and then, when they dried, they would pull that plaster out. And it would literally be a 3D model of the foot that had made the prints. And so, as the officers are working on these casts, Robert says to one of the officers that these prints looked really odd to him, like they were familiar in some way, but he just couldn't place where he had seen them before. Less than an hour later, when the plaster had dried, the officers pulled them out, and they handed them to Robert. And as soon as Robert looked at them, he physically reacted to what he was seeing. It was like he was disappointed. And then, without saying anything, he just walked down the beach with these plaster casts until he got to the secluded area, where he sat down, and he sat there for hours. And hours, just staring at the plaster casts, seemingly unaffected by the sun that was blazing down on him the whole time, and the tide that was very quickly creeping up on him. The local officers who were watching this, they didn't know anything about Robert. All they knew is his reputation, which is he is this totally legendary detective. And so they didn't dare question his methods, even though this seemed really odd, what he was doing. Finally, by mid-afternoon, Robert would put the cast down. He would stand up, and he would walk back over to the mystified local officers. And when he walked up to them, he would say, "There's no reason to stay at the beach any longer or interview any more witnesses. I think I've solved the case." But then, instead of elaborating, he just turned around and walked up off the beach and headed back for his hotel. The local officers just looked at each other and shrugged, and they left too. Early the next day, the bullet that had killed Andre Monet was found on the beach. And so, when Robert showed up to the beach, the chief of police handed him this bullet in an effort to help him continue the investigation. And as soon as Robert looked at it, he sighed and said, "Okay, now I know for sure what happened." And then Robert proceeded to break down the murder. He said the killer woke up in the middle of the night, on the night that Andre was killed, and he got out of his bed. He put on his clothes, and then he headed down to the beach. There, he encountered Andre Monet, a man he didn't know, who was most likely out for a midnight stroll as well. The two men struck up a friendly conversation, but at some point, it turned into some sort of quarrel, at which point the killer drew his pistol, shot Andre in the chest, and then fled the scene. Robert told the local police chief that the reason he knew all these details is because he had been the killer. He killed Andre Monet, but he didn't do it on purpose, and he didn't remember, because he killed Andre Monet while he was sleepwalking. He told the chief when he was given those plaster casts of those footprints, he knew immediately why he thought those prints looked so familiar. Because as soon as he looked at the casts, he could tell whoever had made the prints was missing a toe. And as it happened, Robert was missing a toe. So those prints looked exactly like his footprints. And that morning, when he had woken up in his hotel room, before even going down to the beach, he had noticed that his shoes and his socks, which were next to his bed, were sandy and damp. And he thought that was so strange because he couldn't remember how they got that way, but he was too busy to investigate. And that night, after he had sat all day looking at the casts and then left the beach, leaving the local police officers totally mystified, he had gone back to his room. And the first thing he did was get his revolver out from under his pillow, and he discovered that one bullet was missing. and he always kept his revolver fully loaded. And so, he spent the rest of the night trying to convince himself that this was just one big coincidence. But the following morning, when he was given that bullet, he knew immediately that this was not a coincidence. The bullet that had killed Andre Monet was the same type of ammunition that he loaded his revolver with. And so, he had to be the killer. He had effectively caught himself. The police were totally shocked and did not believe this at first. More specifically, they didn't want to believe that Robert, their star detective, was behind this horrible homicide. But eventually, after examining all the evidence, they agreed he had to be the killer. But to test whether this really was sleepwalking and not some elaborate cover-up by Robert, they decided to conduct an experiment. Robert, who was fully cooperative with the investigation, was told to sleep in this jail cell where he would be monitored 24/7 by armed guards. And in this cell with him would be a revolver loaded with blank rounds, and he was told to keep it under his pillow. For the first couple of days, nothing happened. Robert never touched the revolver during the day or when he was asleep. But about a week into this experiment, Robert suddenly woke up in the middle of the night in this trance-like state. He reached under his pillow, pulled out the revolver, and began firing at the guards right outside of the cell. And so, this convinced the police that Robert had been telling the truth about what happened to Andre Monet. He really had killed him while he was sleepwalking. A decision was made not to prosecute Robert for the murder. Instead, they decided to basically exile him for everybody's protection. And so, from then until 1937, when Robert died, he was forced to live alone on this secluded farm outside of Paris, where the only visitors he ever got were doctors, who would only show up during the day and with armed bodyguards. On the 18th of December, 1956, a brand new game show called To Tell the Truth aired on a major American television network. The premise of the show was relatively simple. 4 celebrity judges would be presented with 3 people called contestants, who all claimed to be the same person. And this person, who they claimed to be, was always remarkable in some way. They had some incredible talent, or some crazy job, or they had accomplished something extraordinary. One of these 3 contestants was the real person they were claiming to be. The other 2 people were doing their best to pretend to be that person. And it was the job of the celebrity judges to try to figure out who was telling the truth. So, for a set amount of time on the show, the celebrity judges would ask the contestants questions about their background and try to figure out, who was who. And then, at the end of the time, the celebrities would cast a vote about who they thought was the real remarkable person. After the votes were tallied up, the host would have the real remarkable person stand up to reveal themselves, and the entire audience would go crazy. And that was the show. And the show became quite popular. So popular, in fact, that today, nearly 70 years later, it's still on the air. And over this show's very long history, virtually all the episodes are pretty similar. It's a pretty redundant show, but there is one episode that will forever go down as the most unique. In October of 1972, 3 contestants walked out onto the stage in front of the 4 celebrity judges, and they all introduced themselves as Edwards. Then the host of the show read aloud the biography of the real Edwards, and he would say that Ed, at one point, was on the FBI's list of the top 10 most wanted criminals in America for crimes like armed robbery and impersonating a federal officer. And then, after he was finally caught by law enforcement and went to prison, a prison guard helped him turn his life around. And then, upon release from prison 14 years later, Edward remained this reformed criminal and became a successful author and motivational speaker who specialized in telling people how to identify conmen and criminals and how to protect themselves from these people. After the real Edwards biography was read aloud, the 3 contestants sat down, and the celebrity judges began asking them questions about their past. And then, after the time was up, the celebrities cast their votes, and then the real Edwards was revealed. And even though 2 of the 4 celebrity judges had correctly identified the right Edwards, the crowd was totally astonished at who this guy actually was, because he did not look like this ex-convict. He looked like this kind of all-American middle-aged father who was totally harmless and wouldn't hurt a fly. But either way, the show ended. And then the world forgot about Edwards until 2009. That year, Ed's arranged daughter, 40-year-old April Bellazio, finally decided to investigate something that had plagued her for her whole childhood. Despite her father's claims that he was this reformed criminal and the stand-up, law-abiding guy, she didn't believe it. She never believed it. She thought he had never been reformed and just was a criminal and always had been. Behind closed doors, Ed was violent and abusive, and he was a compulsive liar. She remembered in the 1970s and 80s, when she was a young kid, Ed would make their family pack up and move, sometimes in the middle of the night. And April always assumed it was because her dad was wrapped up in something criminal. But every time she asked him, he would say, "Oh, well, I was an informant when I was in jail, and I snitched on some people, and some of those people have figured out where we live, and so we got to move." April knew he was lying, but there was nothing she could do, and so they just kept on moving around. But she always thought something else was going on. So, in 2009, when April is now this 40-year-old woman, she's laying in bed one night and finally says, "You know what? I'm just going to start Googling some stuff." So she hops on her laptop and she starts typing in the different names of towns that she and her family lived in as a kid. And then, after she'd write the name of the town, she'd write unsolved mystery or unsolved crime, and she would see if anything popped up. And so, as she began looking, she found one in 1980. It was an unsolved murder in a town called Watertown, Wisconsin, that happened right around the time that her family very briefly lived in this town. There was this young teenage couple that had left. They were at this wedding and had driven down a dead-end road, just enjoying each other's company, when an unknown assailant who matched the description of Edwards walked up to their car, broke in, shot them both to death, and then disappeared. And so, on a hunch, April called the Watertown Police Department the following day and told them that she thought her father might have been responsible for this double homicide. It's just a hunch, but he matches the description. We were there in this very small window of time when it happened. And so, the police said, "Okay, we'll go have a look." And so, the Watertown police, they tracked down Edwards, who was living in Kentucky at the time, and they got him to give them a DNA sample. And when they tested the DNA sample, it matched these samples that were taken at the crime scene in 1980. And so, Ed Edwardshi was arrested and brought back to Wisconsin. And as soon as he was in custody, he confessed to the murder. And then, he requested the death penalty. But he was told the maximum punishment for this crime was life in prison. Ed didn't like this, and so he confessed to another double homicide from 1977 in Ohio, where he killed another teenage couple, thinking that would give him the death penalty. But through a loophole, they said, "Well, actually, that still won't get you the death penalty.
You're still facing life in prison." And so, frustrated, Edwards revealed a third murder he had perpetrated. In 1996, he had killed his own foster son for the insurance money. And so, for this crime, he was eligible for capital punishment, and so he was sentenced to death. But he would die of natural causes 2 years later, in 2011, before the state could execute him. Since his death, cold case investigators and members of his own family have theorized that Ed Edwards is almost certainly responsible for more killings beyond just the 5 he happened to confess to. In fact, many people believe Ed Edwards could actually be the infamous Zodiac Killer, who's one of the nation's most notorious uncaught serial killers that killed 37 people in Northern California in the 1960s and 1970s. If this is true, then Ed Edwards did not become a killer after he was on that game show in 1972. No. When he showed up for that game show and stood in front of the audience and smiled and answered questions to the celebrity panelists, at that time, as you're watching him on TV, he would have already been a seasoned serial killer with dozens and dozens of victims. But Ed stopped confessing to murders after that third confession, because he was just kind of using those murders as bargaining chips to get what he wanted, the death penalty. And once he got it, he went silent. And now that he's dead, we're never going to get another confession out of him. And there's no proof connecting him to any unsolved murder cases. And so, unfortunately, it's unlikely we'll ever know the full extent of Ed's reign of terror.